Howdy, stranger. Tonight we're traveling back to a time when your age was about as reliable as a three-legged horse in a derby race, the American Old West, where people aged without ever knowing exactly how old they were. Imagine living your entire life without celebrating a single birthday, never blowing out candles, never dreading the big 3-0 or 4-0, because, well, you simply had no idea when those milestones passed you by. And let me tell you something right now, you probably wouldn't survive a week in this world, where your smartphone can't remind you that your birthday's coming up, and Amazon won't deliver your age-appropriate skincare routine to your doorstep. So, before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I do here. I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your location and local time in the comments below. I always wonder what corners of the world these stories reach when the lights go down. Relax, turn off your notifications, slow down your thoughts, and imagine that the only light around comes from a campfire. That's where today's story begins. As you listen with your eyes closed and let the Old West keep you company until sleep arrives, you're sitting by that crackling fire now, watching orange sparks dance up toward a sky crowded with more stars than any city dweller has ever seen. The year is, well, that's just it. Out here, nobody's quite sure what year it is, let alone what day. Back east, they might have newspapers dated 1873 or 1882. But out here on the frontier, time moves differently. Calendar pages aren't flipping in sync with the rhythm of your life. Days blur into seasons, seasons into years, and years into the vague notion that you've been around for quite some time now. You reach up to rub your face, feeling the weather-beaten skin that's seen too much sun and wind. How old are you? 35, 42, 49? In truth, you only know you were born sometime after that big snow or the spring after PA built the cabin. Your mother never wrote it down. She couldn't write at all. There was no birth certificate, no family Bible with dates carefully inscribed. In this world, your birthday is a luxury that belongs to the wealthy, the educated, or the particularly fastidious. A man rides into your camp, dismounting with a grunt that suggests his joints have traveled more miles than he cares to remember. Evening, he offers, settling by your fire without invitation, the courtesy of the trail. You study him as he warms his hands. He could be 40 or 60, impossible to tell. His beard might be prematurely grey, or he might be carrying his years remarkably well. Out here, age isn't a number. It's written in how straight a man sits in his saddle, how quickly he draws his gun, how steady his hands remain when pouring his coffee. Been riding long? You ask, the standard greeting that substitutes for how are you in territories where small talk is as scarce as water. Since I was a boy, he answers, which tells you nothing and everything at once. He doesn't say since I was 12 or for 20 years, because he has no reference for those numbers. Instead, he measures his life in events. Since before the war, or started riding the same year as the big drought. History books will later try to organize the Western expansion into neat timelines and decades. But the people living it experienced time as fluid and circumstantial. Without newspapers arriving daily, without birthday celebrations marking the passage of years, without watches synchronizing activities, people existed in a perpetual present punctuated by seasons and significant events. You notice the man's boots. They've been resoled at least twice, the leather of the uppers cracked but carefully maintained. Out here, possessions age more precisely than people. You might gauge someone's time on the frontier by the wear on their saddle, the patina of their six-shooter, or how many times they've patched their only coat. Historians still debate whether this chronological uncertainty was predominantly a hardship or a kind of freedom. Some argue that without the pressure of watching years accumulate, people simply lived until they couldn't anymore, unburdened by age-related expectations. Others point out the practical difficulties. How do you know when a child is ready for schooling, or when to start paying taxes, or when you're eligible to stake a claim if age requirements exist but your own age remains a mystery? What we do know is that this ambiguity created a society where your worth was measured by your present capabilities rather than your accumulated years. A young man who could shoot straight, break horses, and work from sunup to sundown was considered a full-grown man regardless of whether he'd seen 16 summers or 20. A woman might be considered ready for marriage when she could manage a household, not when she reached a specific birthday. The funny thing is, while modern Americans obsess over age-defying serums and panic at the appearance of each new wrinkle, these frontier folks were inadvertently practicing a philosophy that contemporary wellness gurus charge thousands to preach. Age is just a number, and perhaps not even that. It's how you live that matters. Though, to be fair, when your daily exfoliation routine consists of sand blown into your face during dust storms, and your moisturizer is whatever animal fat is left over from last night's dinner, maybe ignorance about your exact age is actually a blessing. As the night deepens, you offer the stranger some coffee, the frontier's currency of hospitality. He accepts with a nod, and as you hand him the tin cup, you notice a wedding band on his finger, worn thin like it's been there for decades, or maybe just a few harsh years. Out here, metal ages faster too. Just like people. Got family waiting? You ask. Wife and young'ens, he says. Least, the young'ens were young when I left. Might be grown by now. He says this without irony or precision. Another marker of a world without birthdays or annual celebrations. Children don't turn 5 or 10. They simply grow taller, stronger, more capable, until one day they're no longer children at all. The journey west was itself a kind of rebirth, a shedding of your former life that often included leaving behind any documentation of when that life began. As you pack your belongings onto a covered wagon in St. Louis or Independence, Missouri, you're making decisions about what's essential enough to justify its weight on the arduous trail ahead. That family Bible with birth dates, left behind for something more immediately useful, an extra sack of flour, another box of ammunition, a sturdier axe. Who needs to remember they were born on October 12th, when they're trying not to die crossing the Rockies? Westward Ho! Was more than just a rallying cry. It was an invitation to reinvent yourself, age included. People routinely shaved years off or added them on depending on what seemed advantageous. Too young to buy land. Suddenly you're about 25, give or take, looking for a husband in a territory where women are scarce. Perhaps you're just turned 18, despite the crow's feet that suggest otherwise. In an era before photo ID or computerized records, your age was whatever you claimed it to be with enough conviction. The wagon trains themselves created a new way of marking time. Years later, settlers wouldn't recall their age at important life events, but they'd remember with perfect clarity whether something happened to summers after we crossed the Platte, or the winter before the wagon train split at Fort Laramie. The journey became the defining moment that reset their personal chronology. There was life before the trail, and life after it. The journey itself aged people in ways no calendar could capture. You might start the 2,000-mile trek as a carefree 20-something or so, you guessed, and arrive at your destination with grey hair and a permanent stoop, having aged a decade in just 6 months. The harsh conditions, relentless sun, inadequate food, contaminated water, and the constant physical labor accelerated the aging process far beyond what your modern moisturizer could ever hope to combat. Seriously, your $75 night cream with age-defying technology would be laughably inadequate against the wrinkle-inducing power of pulling a wagon uphill through mountain passes while surviving on hardtack and jerky. You watch as the stranger by your fire sips his coffee, his gaze distant as if seeing something beyond the flames. Crossed at Council Bluffs, he says unprompted, referring to a popular Missouri River crossing point. Lost to oxen and my mother's rocking chair getting here. He doesn't mention how many years ago this happened. Like most settlers, he measures distance in events rather than time. Historical records show that many pioneers literally lost track of time during the journey. Diaries that started with meticulous daily entries often devolved into sporadic updates with uncertain dates. Thursday or maybe Friday appears frequently in surviving journals, alongside entries like been traveling for many weeks now instead of precise dates. When every day involves the same exhausting routine of walking beside slow-moving oxen from sunrise to sunset, the days blend together into an undifferentiated blur. The most reliable timekeepers on these journeys were often the women who tracked lunar cycles out of biological necessity. Monthly flows provided a calendar of sorts when all other markers of time had disappeared. It's a curious fact of frontier life that a woman might have a better sense of how many months had passed than her husband, though even she would likely lose track of years without some system to count them. Children experienced this temporal dislocation differently. Imagine growing up without knowing how old you were, without age-appropriate expectations. You weren't a 7-year-old or a 12-year-old. You were simply big enough to gather firewood now, or strong enough to help with the hunting, or tall enough to reach the wagon bed. Your progression through childhood wasn't marked by candles on a cake, but by gradually increasing responsibilities. My oldest boy was knee-high when we left Missouri, the stranger tells you, using the universal frontier measurement for children's ages. Couldn't hold a rifle yet. By the time we reached Oregon Territory, he was shooting our dinner regular as sunrise. There's pride in his voice, but also a subtle melancholy. He missed watching the incremental changes, too focused on survival to notice his son's daily growth, until suddenly the boy wasn't really a boy anymore. The wagon trains created their own peculiar society with its own measurements of status. Your place in the hierarchy wasn't determined by your age, but by your usefulness. A 16-year-old who could hunt, track, or speak with native tribes might be treated with the respect usually reserved for elders, while a 60-year-old who couldn't pull their weight might be viewed as a burden rather than a source of wisdom. One of the least known facts about these westward journeys is that they often scrambled family hierarchies in ways that would have been unthinkable back east. Young men and women barely out of childhood might find themselves making life or death decisions for entire families if they proved more adaptable to frontier conditions than their parents. Age-based authority gave way to competence-based leadership with remarkable speed. Historians still debate whether this meritocratic approach was ultimately beneficial or harmful to frontier society. Some argue it created a dynamic, adaptable population that valued skill over seniority, while others point to the lost wisdom and unnecessary risks taken when experienced voices were ignored in favor of youthful vigor. As night deepens around your campfire, the stranger reaches into his saddlebag and pulls out a worn leather pouch. From it, he extracts something surprising, a pocket watch. It's tarnished and dented, clearly not functional for some time, but he handles it with reverence. Family heirloom, you ask? He nods. Grandfather's. Stopped ticking somewhere around Fort Bridger. Never saw much point in getting it fixed out here. The watch has become a talisman rather than a timepiece, a connection to ancestry rather than a way to measure hours. This was surprisingly common on the frontier, people carrying broken timepieces as keepsakes long after they'd stopped serving their original purpose. These non-functioning watches and clocks were physical reminders of a more regimented existence they'd left behind. For many, the freedom from tick-ticking punctuality was part of the frontier's appeal. Back east, the stranger continues, turning the watch over in his calloused hands. Man's whole life runs by one of these. Up at 6, dinner at noon, bed by 9. Out here, you eat when hungry and sleep when tired. He slips the watch back into its pouch with a small smile. Reckon that's why I never bothered to fix it. And there's the irony of frontier timekeeping. Many came west partly to escape the rigid schedules imposed by industrial society, only to discover that natural rhythms imposed their own inflexible demands. You might not answer to a factory whistle, but you still planted when the ground thawed and harvested before the first frost, rose with the sun and retired with its setting. The freedom from clocks didn't mean freedom from time's passage. It just meant measuring that passage differently, by seasons and harvests rather than hours and minutes. Those natural rhythms became your calendar once you settled in the West. The watch in the stranger's pocket may have stopped, but your body still runs on cycles that can't be ignored. You learn to read time in the land around you, in the first crocus pushing through melting snow, in the call of returning geese, in the height of cornstalks, in the changing angle of sunlight through your cabin window. These aren't just poetic observations. They're practical necessities for survival when conventional timekeeping has been abandoned. My second spring here, you tell the stranger, offering more coffee. I nearly starved, waiting for the right time to plant. Back east, we always planted after the last frost in April. Out here, April means nothing. The mountains make their own weather. You learned the hard way that the earth itself keeps better time than any calendar. Now you watch for specific signs, certain wildflowers blooming, the arrival of particular birds, the texture of soil between your fingers, to tell you when to plant. This system of observational timekeeping was surprisingly sophisticated. Frontier farmers developed intricate knowledge of seasonal indicators specific to their localities. The farmer's almanac might declare planting dates based on latitude, but a seasoned homesteader in Wyoming territory could tell you exactly when to sow wheat by watching when the aspens at a particular elevation started to leaf out, or when certain insects emerged. What's fascinating to historians is how these natural markers became the dominant way people tracked the passage of years. Ask an elderly pioneer when something significant happened, and you'd rarely get 1868 or when I was 42. Instead, you'd hear during the year of the big floods or 2 winters after the grasshopper plague. Major natural events, droughts, blizzards, unusually abundant harvests, became the chronological reference points around which personal and community histories were organized. You notice the stranger watching the stars, reading them like a timepiece. Moons waxing, he observes, be full in about 3 nights. This astronomical awareness was common on the frontier, where the night sky served as both clock and calendar. People who couldn't read or write could often track lunar cycles with impressive accuracy. Having learned that certain activities, hunting, planting, harvesting, even cutting timber, yielded better results when aligned with lunar phases, the lack of standardized timekeeping created practical challenges that modern Americans can hardly imagine. How do you arrange to meet someone without being able to specify an exact time? The solution was both elegant and imprecise. I'll meet you at the trading post when the sun's 2 handwidths above the eastern ridge. Time was measured in relation to natural phenomena and in broad categories: morning, midday, afternoon, dusk, rather than hours and minutes. One particularly odd timekeeping method that emerged involved using cigarettes as impromptu hourglasses. Be back in about 2 smokes' time was a common way of indicating a relatively short duration. Given that hand-rolled cigarettes tended to burn at similar rates, this was a surprisingly functional system for brief time periods. It's the frontier equivalent of telling someone you'll meet them in the time it takes to listen to 3 songs on Spotify. Practical, if not precisely scientific. The stranger chuckles when you mention this practice. My wife measures cooking time in songs, he says. Beans are done after singing, oh, Susanna 3 times through. Domestic timekeeping often relied on such rhythmic methods, churning butter until you'd recited a particular poem twice, or kneading bread through 5 renditions of a hymn. This reliance on natural markers and repetitive tasks to measure time created a different relationship with aging. Without birthdays to tick off another year, aging became more closely tied to physical changes and life events. You weren't suddenly old on your 60th birthday. Instead, you gradually recognized your aging through your body's decreasing stamina, your graying hair, the marriage of your children, the birth of grandchildren. Historical records suggest this more fluid approach to age may have had psychological benefits. Studies of surviving diaries and letters reveal less anxiety about aging milestones than in contemporary accounts from more civilized areas where birthdays were regularly observed. When you don't know you've just turned 40, you don't have a midlife crisis about it. A little-known fact about frontier timekeeping is that many communities developed their own local time standards, based on solar patterns specific to their geography. Before railroad time standardization, a town might decide that noon was when the shadow of a particular mountain peak reached a certain boulder. This created a patchwork of local time zones that made perfect sense to residents, but confounded travelers. Your watch, even if it worked, would need constant adjustment as you moved from settlement to settlement. Heard tell they're trying to make everybody run on the same time back east. The stranger comments, referring to early efforts at time standardization. Seems unnatural, like telling the sun when to rise instead of the other way around. His skepticism was common among frontier dwellers, who viewed mechanical time as an artificial imposition on natural rhythms. Historians still debate whether this resistance to standardized time was merely practical, people living according to natural cycles that worked for their environment, or represented a deeper, philosophical stance against the industrializing East. Some scholars argue that rejecting clock time was a deliberate choice by those seeking independence from societal constraints, while others suggest it was simply a pragmatic adaptation to life without reliable timepieces. The conversation around your campfire turns to children as the stranger mentions his own back home. My youngest started talking just after we harvested the first corn crop, he says. This pattern of marking developmental milestones by seasonal events rather than ages was universal in frontier outrearing. Children weren't walking by 13 months, but walking just after the spring roundup. Physical and cognitive development was tracked through natural and agricultural timelines, rather than medical charts, with age-based expectations. This approach created both challenges and benefits for children. Without rigid age-based expectations, children might develop at their own pace, without the pressure of meeting specific milestones by certain birthdays. However, this same flexibility could mean delayed recognition of genuine developmental problems. If you don't know a child is 4 years old and should be speaking in sentences, you might miss important early interventions. You might think this ambiguity about age would create problems for education, and you'd be right. Frontier schools typically grouped children by ability rather than age, since few families could accurately report how old their children were. A first reader class might contain children ranging from what we'd now consider 6 to 12 years old. This multi-age grouping sometimes created more peer teaching opportunities, but could also mean older children were held back by younger classmates. The most peculiar aspect of this age-free existence was how it affected courtship and marriage. Without clear ages, communities developed alternative markers for when young people were ready for marriage. For women, it was often after their bodies had matured and they'd mastered essential household skills. For men, it was when they could support a family through demonstrated hunting, farming, or trade skills. Ready for courting was a status conferred by community recognition rather than reaching a specific birthday. How long you been married? You ask the stranger, noticing again the worn wedding band. He ponders this, clearly calculating. Since before we came west. After the war, I reckon. Been through 7 or 8 crop cycles here. Like most frontier dwellers, he measures the duration of his marriage, not in anniversary celebrations, but in accumulated seasons and significant events. The stranger's weathered face in the firelight tells its own story about age on the frontier. Even if he doesn't know his years, his skin maps a history of sun exposure, wind damage, and hardship that no calendar could record. In the Old West, appearance became the primary way people gauged age, both their own and others. You learned to read the signs, hands gnarled from decades of work, eyes crinkled from squinting against the prairie sun, backs permanently stooped from years behind a plow. You look like you've seen your share of winters, the stranger comments, studying your face across the flames. It's not an insult, but a simple observation. The frontier's tactful way of acknowledging that your appearance suggests experience. Out here, looking older isn't something to fight with creams and surgeries. It's a badge of honor, visible proof that you've survived what would have killed lesser folks. The aging process worked differently on the frontier than in our climate-controlled, sunscreens-lathered modern lives. Historical photographs reveal how dramatically frontier living accelerated aging. A 30-year-old homesteader might easily be mistaken for 50 by today's standards. The combination of constant sun exposure, poor nutrition, physical labor, limited healthcare, and chronic stress etched itself into faces and bodies with ruthless efficiency. You rub your calloused hands together, noticing how the skin has thickened and cracked. These aren't the hands you had when you first arrived out west, whenever that was. They've been transformed by years of work without gloves, by freezing winters and scorching summers, by countless small injuries that never quite healed properly. Your body has become a timeline in itself, each scar marking an event more precisely than any date could. Lost these 2 fingers the first winter after we dug the well, the stranger says, noticing your gaze on his damaged left hand. This was how physical injuries functioned in frontier chronology. Not as the accident in 1878, but as the accident after the well was dug. Bodies became personal calendars, carrying visible markers of life's timeline. What historians find most fascinating about this appearance-based aging is how it affected social hierarchies. In a world without verifiable ages, respect and authority often correlated directly with how old you looked. A prematurely grey 30-year-old might command more deference than a youthful-looking 45-year-old, regardless of their actual experiences or wisdom. Your social capital was quite literally skin deep. The speed at which frontier life aged people created some truly bizarre situations. Historical accounts describe young women who, after just 2 or 3 harsh years of frontier living, returned east to find friends didn't recognize them. One particularly heartbreaking diary entry from 1867 recounts how a woman's own mother failed to identify her at a train station, having aged so dramatically during 4 years in Kansas Territory that she appeared to be her mother's contemporary rather than her daughter. You know what they say, the stranger offers with a wry smile. A year on the frontier is worth 5 back east. This wasn't just a saying, but a lived reality. The accelerated aging wasn't solely physical, mental and emotional maturation happened at warp speed too. Children took on adult responsibilities early, young adults made life or death decisions daily, and the psychological weathering matched the physical. One peculiar custom that emerged in some frontier communities was the practice of age equivalency, a tacit agreement about roughly how old someone appeared to be, which became their de facto age for social purposes. She's about a 30 winters woman, or he's got the look of 40-some years on him became workable substitutes for actual age. These communal estimates created a functional system where precise ages weren't available. You shift on your bedroll, feeling the familiar ache in your joints, another bodily calendar, marking changes in weather more reliably than any barometer. Your bones know a storm is coming hours before the clouds appear on the horizon. This physical attunement to natural cycles becomes yet another way of marking time when conventional methods have fallen away. A little-known fact about frontier aging is that identical twins often aged at dramatically different rates depending on their life circumstances. Historical photographs show pairs who started life indistinguishable but ended up looking a decade apart in apparent age after one stayed east while the other went west. The physical toll of frontier life was so significant that it could override even genetic programming. The most peculiar aspect of appearance-based aging was how it affected romantic relationships. Without clear ages, couples might form with vastly different birth years without ever realizing it. A man and woman who both appeared to be about 30 might actually have been born 15 years apart. These age gaps went unnoticed and unremarked because no one, including the couple themselves, knew their actual ages. "My wife looks older than me now," the stranger says quietly, "though I reckon she's younger by a few years." Birthing 5 children in a dirt floor cabin ages a woman fast. This observation touches on one of the harshest realities of frontier aging, the disproportionate physical toll on women. Repeated pregnancies without adequate medical care, combined with endless domestic labor, meant women typically showed age faster than their male counterparts. Historians still debate whether this appearance-based social ordering was predominantly harmful or beneficial. Some argue it created a meritocracy where those who had survived the longest, as evidenced by their aging naturally, rose to positions of authority. Others point out the unfairness of judging capability by physical appearance, particularly when genetics and circumstance could make someone look older or younger independent of their actual experiences. The firelight flickers across the stranger's face, highlighting the deep creases around his eyes and mouth. In another world, your world, before you came west, you might have pitied these signs of aging. Out here, they simply tell you he survived, endured, persisted. The wrinkles aren't flaws to be erased, but achievements to be acknowledged. Funny thing, he muses, poking at the fire with a stick. Back east, folks was always trying to look younger than they was. Out here, sometimes it helps to look older than you are. He's touching on another frontier reality. The advantage of appearing experienced in a world where inexperience could be fatal. Looking older than your years might gain you respect, better trading terms, or leadership opportunities that would otherwise be denied. This premium on appearing seasoned lead to some amusing frontier customs. Young men sometimes deliberately weathered their appearance, working without hats to encourage premature wrinkling, growing beards as soon as possible, even rubbing dirt into their skin to create a more weathered look. Looking fresh-faced wasn't just unattractive, it could be dangerous, marking you as an easy target for swindlers or those looking to take advantage of greenhorns. For women, the calculation was more complex. While appearing experienced had value, there was still cultural pressure to maintain some semblance of youth, particularly for unmarried women. This created the strange phenomenon of frontier women simultaneously trying to look competent and experienced while also attempting to preserve their appearance against the relentless environmental assault. Had a strange thing happen at the general store last month, you tell the stranger, remembering suddenly. Young fella called me sir and offered to help with my packages. Never happened before. This moment, the first time you're treated as old by others, often became more significant as a marker of aging than any birthday would have been. These social signals told you where you stood in life's progression more clearly than numbers ever could. The stranger nods in recognition. First time someone called me Ultima, I looked around to see who they was talking to. His chuckle carries a hint of melancholy. Didn't feel old. Still don't. Just more weathered. This disconnect between internal experience and external appearance is universal across time, but was particularly pronounced on the frontier, where aging happened so rapidly that your self-image might struggle to keep pace with your changing appearance. As you both fall silent, watching the fires dance, you consider how differently time and aging work out here compared to the world you left behind. In towns and cities back east, people fight against time, measuring it obsessively, trying to slow its effects. Here on the frontier, you surrender to it, letting it mark you however it will, wearing its passage as testament to your endurance. That endurance, the ability to continue working despite what time has done to your body, becomes the true measure of age on the frontier. As the night deepens around your campfire, you and the stranger silently acknowledge what both of you know. Out here, you're only as old as your capacity to work. A young person is someone who can still haul water, chop wood, plow fields, regardless of how many years they've seen. An old person is simply someone whose body has begun to fail them, whose labor can no longer sustain their survival. Still break my own horses, the stranger mentions with quiet pride, answering a question you haven't asked about where he stands in life's progression. His ability to perform this demanding, dangerous task tells you more about his functional age than any birth certificate could. In frontier society, working years weren't something you counted. They were something you proved daily through continued capability. You flex your own hands in the firelight, assessing. You can still grip an axe handle from sunrise to sunset without your fingers cramping. You can still track game for miles without your knees giving out. By frontier standards, you remain firmly in your working prime, regardless of the grey in your beard or the lines around your eyes. Time passes differently when measured by function rather than years. The stranger watches this self-assessment with knowing eyes. Man's working life is longer out here, he observes. Back east, they put you out to pasture at a certain age, whether you're used up or not. He's touching on a fundamental difference between frontier aging and more civilized approaches: the lack of arbitrary retirement ages or age-based role transitions. On the frontier, you didn't stop working because you reached 65. You stopped when your body could no longer perform. Historical records confirm this observation. While Eastern society was beginning to implement age-based retirement systems for certain professions in the late 19th century, frontier communities maintained a purely functional approach to work capacity. Diaries and local histories frequently mention elderly individuals, likely in their 60s or 80s by modern reckoning, still actively contributing to essential labor well beyond ages that would have seen them retired in urban settings. Oldest fella in our settlement still traps his own line, you offer. Hands shake too bad for shooting, but he sets traps better than men half his, well, half as weathered. This kind of specialized contribution from older individuals was common. As physical strength waned, experience and specialized skills became more valuable. An aging body might lose certain capabilities while retaining others that remained crucial to community survival. The most peculiar aspect of frontier working life was how it reshuffled age-based expectations. Tasks we now associate with the young, heavy physical labor, dangerous activities, work requiring strength and stamina remained the province of anyone capable of performing them, regardless of apparent age. Meanwhile, roles we typically associate with seniors, council membership, conflict resolution, teaching, weren't automatically granted with age, but earned through demonstrated wisdom and community respect. You watch as the stranger effortlessly rebuilds the fire, his movements efficient despite joints that clearly pain him in the night's growing chill. This paradox was common on the frontier bodies, simultaneously showing signs of advanced age while remaining functionally capable. Modern medicine might classify such individuals as suffering from premature aging, but in frontier terms, they were simply experienced workers whose tools their bodies showed signs of heavy use. Funny thing about work out here, the stranger says, settling back, it ages your body faster but keeps you young in other ways. He's identifying something historians now recognize as a distinctive feature of frontier. Aging, accelerated physical deterioration, coupled with extended functional capability. Your knees might give out decades sooner than your Eastern counterparts, but you'd keep using them productively long after city dwellers had taken to rocking chairs. A fascinating and little-known feature of frontier working life was the development of modified tools for aging bodies. Historical collections include specially balanced axes with grip modifications for arthritic hands, saddles redesigned to accommodate stiffening spines, and other ingenious adaptations that allowed aging workers to continue their essential roles despite physical limitations. These innovations rarely appear in romanticized Western histories but represent a critical aspect of how frontier societies accommodated aging within a work-centered culture. Started using this about 2 winters back, the stranger says, noticing your interest in the unusual handle wrapping on his hunting knife. Fingers don't grip like they used to after that frostbite. Rather than accepting diminished capability, he's adapted his tools to his changing body. The frontier approach to age accommodation. Historians still debate whether this function-based approach to aging was ultimately beneficial or harmful to frontier dwellers. Some argue it created more sustainable communities where every member contributed according to their abilities throughout life, while others point to the physical toll of continued hard labor on aging bodies. What's clear is that it produced a distinctly different relationship between age and work than what was evolving in more civilized regions. Back east, my brother retired from the factory at 50, the stranger comments. Sits on his porch, watching other folks work. Out here, that'd be a death sentence, and a waste. His observation highlights a critical survival aspect of frontier working patterns. In environments where every able body needed to contribute to community survival, the luxury of age-based retirement simply didn't exist. What's particularly interesting about frontier working life is how differently men and women experienced this functional approach to aging. Men might shift from more physically demanding tasks to more skill-based contributions as they aged. But women's domestic labor remained relatively constant throughout life. An old woman might no longer be able to haul water from the creek, but she'd still be expected to cook, clean, mend, and care for younger children. Her working life didn't change in nature so much as in scope and pace. You notice the stranger's gaze drift toward the stars again, measuring the night's progression. "Moon's getting high," he observes. "Reckon it's halfway between sunset and sunrise." This casual astronomical timekeeping reminds you that working rhythms on the frontier followed natural cycles rather than arbitrary schedules. You worked while light allowed and rested when darkness fell, regardless of your age or status. The conversation turns to children, and how differently they entered the working world compared to modern expectations. "My youngest started herding sheep soon as she could walk a mile without tiring," the stranger says. This integration of children into productive labor from early ages wasn't seen as exploitation, but as essential. Education, learning by doing, rather than through formal schooling. This early introduction to work created a different trajectory for aging. Children didn't suddenly become working adults at some arbitrary age of majority. Instead, they gradually accumulated responsibilities proportional to their capabilities. A 10-year-old might already be performing essential adult tasks, while a 20-year-old would still be mastering more complex skills under elder guidance. The sharp dividing lines between childhood, adolescence, and adulthood simply didn't exist. "When did you start working your own land?" you ask, curious about his transition to independence. He ponders this, clearly reaching for a chronological marker. "After that big migration of '59. No, must have been after the drought that killed all the apple trees. Pa was still getting around then, so I wasn't more than a half-grown man." His answer demonstrates how working transitions served as life stage markers more precisely than arbitrary ages. He doesn't know how old he was in years, but he knows exactly where he stood in his progression toward full working capability. What many don't realize about frontier aging is how the physical toll of constant labor created a population that was simultaneously more physically worn and more functionally capable than their eastern counterparts. Photographs from the period frequently show frontier workers with the bodies of much older individuals performing tasks that would challenge someone decades younger in more civilized regions. Their physically demanding lifestyle both accelerated aging and extended working capacity in a paradoxical cycle. "Reckon I've got another 20 years of good work in me," the stranger says, though he has no idea how old he actually is. His estimate isn't based on an anticipated lifespan minus his current age, but on an assessment of how his body feels and how long he's observed others continuing to function before their capabilities failed them. It's a purely practical calculation, untethered from numerical age. Those practical calculations about your body's remaining functionality take on life or death importance when illness strikes on the frontier. The stranger's offhand comment about having 20 good years assumes something that frontier folk could never take for granted, that disease or injury wouldn't dramatically alter that timeline overnight. Without modern medicine, each illness became its own marker of time, a potential dividing line between before and after in your personal history. "Caught the fever to summer's back," you tell the stranger, pouring the last of the coffee into his cup. "Laid me flat for nearly a month. Wasn't sure I'd see another harvest." This experience, surviving a serious illness, often functioned as a more significant life milestone than any birthday. In many frontier diaries, people measured their lives by the serious illnesses they'd survived, each one adding perceived age regardless of the actual time passed. The stranger nods in recognition. "Yellow fever took half our settlement after the big floods. Those who pulled through were never the same after aged them something fierce." This observation touches on a medical reality that frontier dwellers understood intuitively. Certain illnesses aged the body permanently, creating a biological shift that might add a decade of wear in a matter of weeks. Medical historians have identified this phenomenon in studies of frontier populations. Surviving certain diseases, particularly respiratory infections, malaria, and typhoid, often triggered accelerated aging processes. Individuals might emerge from these illnesses with permanently diminished lung capacity, weakened hearts, damaged kidneys, or compromised immune systems. Their functional age had increased dramatically, even if only months had passed on a calendar. Doc Simmons over in Fort Laramie says, "I got an old man's heart now," the stranger says, tapping his chest. Says it's working twice as hard as it should. This kind of diagnosis, comparing organ function to age expectations, was surprisingly common in frontier medicine. Despite its limited diagnostic tools, physicians assessed patients not by their chronological age, which was often unknown, but by how their bodies functioned compared to typical patterns of deterioration. One particularly fascinating aspect of frontier medical practice was how it adapted to a population with uncertain ages. Without knowing if a patient was 35 or 50, doctors developed symptom-based approaches rather than age-based ones. Historical medical journals from frontier physicians show remarkably nuanced descriptions of functional capacity rather than reliance on age-related norms. They might describe a patient as having the lungs of a man who's worked in mines for a decade, rather than the lungs of a 60-year-old. The absence of age-based treatment guidelines sometimes led to better care than patients might have received in more advanced settings. Frontier doctors assessed each patient individually rather than applying standardized protocols based on age categories. A young-looking 60-year-old might receive more aggressive treatment than would have been considered appropriate back east, while a prematurely aged 30-year-old wouldn't be undertreated based on their chronological youth. "Lost my first wife to childbed fever," the stranger says, quietly, poking at the fire. "Second one nearly went the same way with our third child." Doc said she aged 10 years in that one night. This tragic reality of frontier life, the dangers of childbirth without modern medical intervention, created one of the starkest gender disparities in aging patterns. Women who survived multiple difficult births often showed dramatically accelerated aging compared to their husbands of similar years. Historical records reveal that pregnancy and childbirth functioned as their own brutal timeline for frontier women. Many measured their lives not in years but in births. "I was young before my fourth child, or my health broke after my sixth lying in." Each pregnancy potentially added years of physical wear, regardless of the calendar time elapsed. A woman might age decades in just a few years of repeated pregnancies under harsh frontier conditions. You both fall silent, contemplating the fire as it burns lower. There's a shared understanding that illness and mortality are constant companions out here, lurking just beyond the firelight. The healthy stranger sitting across from you tonight could be ravaged by disease tomorrow, his capable body transformed overnight into that of a much older person by frontier standards. Strangest thing about getting sick out here, you offer after a while, is how it changes how folks see you afterward. Had a neighbor, strong as an ox before the mountain fever took him, survived, but walked with a cane after. People started calling him Old Jake right away, though he couldn't have seen more than 40 winters. This social recategorization following illness was a common frontier experience. Your perceived age could shift dramatically based on visible changes in function, regardless of years past. What many don't realize about frontier medicine is how sophisticated its understanding of recuperation became. Despite limited formal knowledge, communities developed intricate systems for supporting recovery based on careful observation of how bodies responded to illness over time. Historical accounts describe detailed convalescent protocols, specific foods for rebuilding strength, carefully graduated activity schedules, and seasonal considerations for recovery time. "After my lung sickness, the widow Harmon brought me bone broth every day for a month," the stranger recalls. Said her husband never got his strength back because he worked too soon after the same illness. This kind of experiential wisdom passed through communities by observation rather than medical literature, created effective recovery practices tailored to frontier conditions. Historians still debate whether frontier dwellers ultimately lived longer or shorter lives than their urban counterparts. While they faced greater initial risks from accident and illness, those who survived past middle age often demonstrated remarkable longevity. Without precise birth records, it's difficult to prove, but photographic evidence and written accounts suggest many frontier elders lived into their 80s and 90s by modern reckoning. Despite their physically demanding lives, the most peculiar aspect of frontier medicine was how it created its own measurement of age through health years, rather than chronological ones. Within communities, people might be categorized by how many serious illnesses they'd survived or how many injuries they'd recovered from, creating a sort of medical timeline that substituted for numerical age. He's a 3-fever man might indicate someone who had survived multiple serious illnesses and gained respected elder status as a result. Can still feel that arrow wound when rain's coming, you mention. Rubbing your shoulder where a Comanche raid left its permanent mark 15 years ago, or was it 20? The physical reminders of past injuries became their own calendar, a personal record of events inscribed directly on your body. Each scar, each chronic ache, each lingering weakness told part of your history more reliably than any date. This body-based calendar created a unique relationship with mortality. Without knowing your age in years, you couldn't calculate how much of your expected lifespan remained. Instead, you assessed your proximity to death by monitoring functional decline. How much harder it was to breathe after exertion, how much longer your wounds took to heal, how much more your joints protested in cold weather. These changes provided more meaningful mortality predictions than any actuarial table. My father knew when his time was coming, the stranger says softly, said his body was giving out piece by piece, and he'd counted the pieces. This awareness of incremental decline, watching specific functions fail sequentially, replaced age-based expectations about death. You didn't worry about dying because you'd reached a certain age. You prepared for death when your body showed you it was beginning to surrender. The conversation shifts to the remarkable recoveries sometimes witnessed on the frontier. New and old trapper, oldest man I ever met, you recall, survived being mauled by a grizzly when he was already white-haired, healed up and went right back to his trapline, lived another decade, at least. These stories of unlikely survival, despite advanced age, were treasured in frontier communities, proving that functional capacity, rather than years, determined one's remaining life. What's particularly fascinating about frontier medicine is how it anticipated modern geriatric approaches in some ways. Today's best practices focus on functional assessment rather than chronological age. When determining treatment, exactly the approach frontier doctors were forced to adopt out of necessity. Their inability to rely on numerical age led them to more nuanced, individualized care that sometimes better served their elderly patients. Doc in our settlement won't give up on anyone who's got fight left in them, the stranger observes. Saved our blacksmith after that mill accident. Those city doctors would have let him go, old as he was. This focus on vitality and will, rather than numerical age, created a different approach to treating the elderly, one based on observed resilience, rather than statistical life expectancy. As the night grows colder, you both move closer to the dying fire. There's an unspoken acknowledgement that out here, your next serious illness or injury is never far away. Each of you carries the permanent marks of previous brushes with mortality. Each recovery having aged you in ways no calendar could measure. Each survival demonstrating a resilience that matters more than how many years you've accumulated. This resilience through illness and injury extends to your family line as well, creating generational stories where precise ages blur, but connections remain crystal clear. As the fire burns low, the conversation naturally turns to children and lineage. How families tracked their histories when nobody knew exactly when children were born or relatives died. Got 3 generations under my roof, the stranger volunteers, warming his hands over the embers. My youngest was born the winter after the creek dried up completely. My oldest's first child came during that summer with the grasshopper plague. This method of marking births through concurrent events created family timelines anchored to shared experiences rather than calendar dates. You nod in understanding, having witnessed how frontier families maintained their histories without precise birth dates. My sister's keeping track of her brood by notching a stick for each child, one notch for each summer they've seen. This practice of informal record keeping, notched sticks, knotted cords, marked leather strips, created physical family timelines when paper was scarce and literacy limited. What historical records reveal about these family chronologies is their surprising accuracy despite the lack of precise dates. When researchers have compared informal family records with eventual official documentation created when territories became states, the seasonal placement of births and deaths often matches perfectly, even when the assigned calendar years might be off by 1 or 2. Families knew with certainty that a child was born after harvest but before first snow. Even if they couldn't specify November 1871, the stranger reaches into his shirt and pulls out a small leather pouch worn around his neck. Opening it carefully, he extracts a lock of pale hair tied with faded ribbon. "My first daughter," he explains, "lived just long enough to smile once, then took fever and died. Came in the dry spring before the cattle disease." This method of marking a child's brief life through its relationship to community events ensured that even the shortest lives remained anchored in family memory. This kind of physical memento, locks of hair, preserved first shoes, tiny clothing items, often served as the only concrete record of a child's existence on the frontier. Without birth or death certificates, these objects became crucial documentation, proving that a life, however brief, had occurred. Family histories passed down orally might mention the baby born during the blizzard who lived just 3 days, preserving their memory without recording a single date. Hardest thing about losing track of years, the stranger admits, carefully returning the hair to its pouch, is not knowing how old my living children really are. My eldest boy might be ready to claim his own land soon, or might need another year or 2 of growing. This uncertainty about children's precise ages created practical challenges for frontier families, particularly around major life transitions like schooling, working independently, marriage, or inheritance. Frontier communities developed fascinating workarounds for these age-related milestones. Historical records describe readiness tests for children believed to be approaching school age, being able to reach over their head and touch the opposite ear, having lost certain baby teeth, or demonstrating specific cognitive abilities. Rather than enrolling children at age 6, frontier schools accepted them when they showed these physical and mental markers of readiness. My grandfather lived long enough to see 5 generations, or so the family story goes, you tell the stranger. Nobody knows how old he was when he died, but they say his beard reached his knees and he could still shoot straight enough to hit a squirrel. This kind of family lore, describing remarkable longevity through physical characteristics and preserved abilities rather than numerical age, was typical of frontier genealogies. One particularly curious aspect of frontier family timelines was how they compressed or expanded based on notable events. Years with multiple significant occurrences, natural disasters, battles, disease, outbreaks, might be recorded in elaborate detail across several generations of family stories. Meanwhile, decades of relative calm and prosperity might be condensed into a single phrase. Then came many good years of growing. The family timeline expanded and contracted according to eventfulness, rather than chronological duration. My wife's people mark family age by height against a doorpost, the stranger says. Every full moon, the children stand against it for a new mark. Don't tell them how old they are in years, just how much they've grown since last marking. This growth-based approach to tracking childhood development freed children from age-based expectations while still acknowledging their progression toward adulthood. Historians still debate whether this fluid approach to childhood development was beneficial or detrimental. Some argue that without rigid age categories, frontier children developed according to their individual capabilities rather than arbitrary timetables. Others point out that without age-based protections, children might be pushed into adult responsibilities before they were truly ready, particularly when families faced economic pressures. What's particularly fascinating about frontier family chronologies is how they affected inheritance practices. Without knowing exact ages, families couldn't rely on primogeniture inheritance by the firstborn in its strict form. Instead, many frontier families developed capability-based inheritance systems, where land and property went to whichever child demonstrated the best ability to manage it, regardless of birth order or approximate age. My neighbor left his claim to his third son, though the oldest was still living, you recall, said the third had the best head for farming, even though he was the youngest, or so they reckoned. This merit-based approach to generational transitions sometimes created more sustainable family enterprises, but could also spark bitter disputes when subjective judgments replaced clear age-based succession rules. The most peculiar aspect of frontier family timelines was how they documented aging itself, without birthdays to mark another year's passage. Families noted physical changes as generational signposts. The year Po's hair turned completely white, or when Ma's hands grew too stiff for fine stitching. These functional transitions created a family record of aging more tied to capacity than chronology. Strange to think, the stranger muses, watching the dying fire, that my children don't celebrate birthdays like folks do back east. They mark their growing by what new tasks they can manage each season. This developmental approach to childhood, measuring maturation through increasing capability rather than accumulated years, created a different relationship with aging from the very beginning of life. Family reunions took on special significance in this context, becoming occasions to update mental images of relatives last seen when they were just knee-high, or before their beard grew in, without photographs or precise ages to track changes. These intermittent meetings provided crucial calibration points for family chronologies. You might not know a nephew was now about 16, but seeing him suddenly towering over his mother told you he'd crossed the threshold from boy to young man during your absence. Last time I saw my brother, the stranger says, I barely recognized him. Left home with black hair and a straight back. Now he's grey as winter and walks with a cane. This kind of dramatic transformation between visits was common in frontier family relationships, where years might pass between meetings and no photographs existed to prepare you for the changes time had wrought. What many don't realize about frontier families is how fluid their composition often became across generations. Without precise knowledge of ages, the lines between generations sometimes blurred, particularly in complex households. Historical accounts describe situations where aunts or uncles, raised alongside their nieces and nephews, might be considered siblings rather than different generations, or where second marriages created step relationships that defied clear generational categorization. My stepmother is younger than my oldest sister, you mention, makes for strange family gatherings. This compression of generational difference was surprisingly common on the frontier, where remarriage after widowhood frequently connected individuals from widely separated age cohorts. Without knowing anyone's precise age, these blended families created their own internal logic of relationship that often ignored conventional generational boundaries. As the night deepens and the conversation lulls, you both contemplate the fire's dying embers. There's something profound in how frontier families tracked their histories, not as neat timelines with precise dates, but as rich, interconnected stories where births, deaths, and milestones were embedded in the larger community narrative. Your family wasn't measured in birth certificates and calendar years, but in resilience through harsh winters, in hands growing capable enough for adult tools, in the gradual silvering of hair across decades, in the accumulated wisdom passed from one generation to the next, without anyone ever knowing exactly where one generation ended and another began. The accumulated wisdom of generations found its most colorful expression in the saloon, that frontier institution where stories grew taller with each telling. As your campfire conversation with the stranger winds down, you're reminded of how different the evening might be if you were sitting in one of those smoky establishments instead of under the vast prairie sky. In saloons across the West, men gathered to reshape their personal histories, often adding or subtracting years as the tale required. Ever notice how every man in a saloon claims to be either surprisingly young or impressively old? You ask the stranger with a knowing smile. Never met a barroom regular who admitted to being 43. This observation touches on a peculiar aspect of frontier age perception, the tendency toward strategic aging in social settings, particularly those involving alcohol and audiences. The stranger chuckles, recognizing the truth in your words. Knew a fella who claimed he was 65 and fought at the Alamo. Also claimed he was 35 when trying to impress a young widow in the same evening. This kind of fluid approach to self-reported age was the norm in saloon society, where biographical details shifted according to the impression a man wanted to create. Historical accounts of frontier saloons reveal them as theaters of identity, where age became a malleable performance rather than a fixed fact. Men who wanted to emphasize their youthful vigor might shave years off their appearance, straightening spines that normally stooped. And speaking of recent adventures, the same men, when seeking respect or authority, might exaggerate signs of age, emphasizing gray hairs and battle scars while referencing historical events they claimed to have witnessed. Bartender at Silver Creek served me my first whiskey, you recall. Said I looked old enough, though I couldn't have been more than ... Well, I was still growing into my height. This casual approach to age restrictions was typical in frontier establishments. Without birth certificates to verify age, bartenders relied on appearance, manner, and sometimes simply a young man's ability to pay for his drink. The saloon created its own peculiar age hierarchy that often inverted conventional respect for elders. Young men with fast guns or strong backs frequently commanded more respect than their older counterparts, regardless of wisdom or experience. Meanwhile, the oldest regular customers might be tolerated with a mix of deference and gentle mockery, respected for their survival but ribbed for their diminished capacities. Strangest bar argument I ever saw, the stranger offers, was two old-timers nearly coming to blows over which one was older. Both wanted the honor of being the eldest man in the territory. This competitive aspect of frontier aging, the prestige associated with being the oldest settler or last survivor of a notable event, created social capital that sometimes outweighed the disadvantages of advanced age. What historians find particularly fascinating about saloon culture is how it preserved oral histories through repeated storytelling, despite, or perhaps because, of the fluid approach to factual accuracy. Historical events might be recorded with remarkable detail in these stories, while the storyteller's own age and role in the events shifted with each telling. The Kansas border troubles of the 1850s might be recounted with precise descriptions of weather conditions, participants' clothing, and exact dialogue, all from a narrator who claimed to have been everything from just a boy to already a seasoned fighter during the same events. Half the men in any saloon claimed they rode with Quantrill. You observe, referencing the notorious Confederate guerrilla leader, man would have needed an army of thousands if all the stories were true. This phenomenon of inserting oneself into historical events was a common feature of frontier biography, without documentation to disprove such claims. A compelling storyteller could place himself at any significant moment in Western history, adjusting his purported age to fit the narrative. The stranger nods in recognition, and the other half claimed they fought against him. This mirroring of historical claims, positioning oneself on opposing sides of famous conflicts depending on the current audience, created a saloon historical record that was rich in detail but wildly unreliable regarding who was actually present. One particularly interesting aspect of saloon storytelling was how it created community consensus around certain individuals' ages, despite complete lack of documentation. A charismatic regular might establish himself as about 35 through repeated self-description, and the entire community would accept this approximate age as fact, adjusting their own ages relatively older or younger than the established benchmark. These socially constructed ages became functional truths within the community even when they were objectively impossible. Remember old Pete Matthews at Fort Griffin? The stranger asks, assuming the shared geography of frontier travelers. claimed he was 97 for at least 15 years I knew him. This phenomenon of the permanent age individuals who claimed a particular advanced age and then stopped aging in their personal narrative appears frequently in frontier accounts. These declarative ages, "I'm 69, damn it," and that became fixed points in community chronology regardless of how many years actually passed. This fluid approach to age in social settings served important psychological functions. Without the rigid age milestones of modern society, 40, 50, retirement age, senior discounts, frontier dwellers could position themselves advantageously throughout their lives. A man might present as a seasoned veteran at 25 if it helped him establish a business, or as a spry 40-something at 60 if he were courting a younger woman. Funniest thing I ever saw, you recall, was Peterson and McCabe trying to out-young each other for the blacksmith's daughter. Peterson, who'd been claiming to be 50 and a veteran of 3 wars the week before, suddenly couldn't remember exactly when he was born but thought it was not too long ago. This strategic aging, adjusting one's apparent age according to social circumstances, was an accepted part of frontier social dynamics. Historical records suggest this flexible approach to age might have reduced certain types of age discrimination. Without firm knowledge of individuals' chronological ages, frontier communities were forced to judge people based on observed capabilities, rather than assumptions about what someone of a particular age should or shouldn't be able to do. A silver-haired man who could still outwork younger competitors wouldn't be dismissed simply because he had reached an arbitrary age threshold. The most peculiar aspect of saloon age narratives was how they created parallel life histories for the same individual. A man might have one age identity at church or family gatherings, and an entirely different one in saloon company. These multiple aging narratives weren't necessarily seen as deceptive, but as appropriate contextual presentations of self, different facets of identity for different social settings. "My wife thinks I'm about 50, the stranger admits with a half smile. "Let her believe that when we married, saloon crowd knows I fought in the Mexican War, which would make me somewhat older. Truth is, I don't rightly know myself." This comfortable inhabiting of multiple age narratives was common on the frontier, where the absence of documentation made all age claims equally plausible or implausible. What's particularly fascinating about these saloon stories is how they shaped community understanding of historical events. Without newspapers or history books, many frontier communities relied on saloon storytellers for their connection to the larger historical narrative. The man who claimed to have fought with Custer or witnessed the Alamo, regardless of the chronological impossibility, became the community's living link to these events. The storyteller's questionable age became less important than his role as historical repository. Knew a bartender who kept a special bottle for men claiming to be over 90, you remember, with a chuckle? Said if they were that old, they deserved the good stuff. Had half the old-timers in the territory suddenly adding decades to their age. This kind of social reward for longevity, even claimed longevity, created communities where advanced age carried status rather than stigma. Historians still debate whether this fluid, performative approach to age was ultimately beneficial for frontier communities. Some argue it created more age-integrated societies where capabilities mattered more than birth year, while others suggest it enabled various forms of deception that undermined community trust. What's clear is that it produced a distinctly different relationship with aging than what existed in more documented societies. As your conversation with the stranger winds down, you're both aware that neither of you has specified your actual age, if indeed either of you knows it with any certainty. Instead, you've established your place in life through experiences shared, hardships mentioned, capabilities demonstrated. In this, your campfire exchange mirrors the saloon interactions that shaped frontier society, a place where the story you told about your life mattered more than the number of years you'd accumulated. The stories told in saloons created legends, and some of those legends grew into the infamous outlaws whose ages became as shifting and mysterious as their whereabouts. As night deepens around your campfire, The conversation naturally turns to those larger-than-life figures who haunted the Frontiers collective imagination, men and women who weaponized their age ambiguity to spectacular effect. Heard tell they caught the Sutton kid last month, the stranger mentions, referring to a notorious bank robber. Papers said he was just 19. Week later, another paper claimed he was 34 with 3 different names before Sutton. Man's age changed depending on which judge was sentencing him. This shape-shifting quality of outlaw identities, including their reported ages, made them particularly elusive in a world without standardized identification. You nod, familiar with how outlaws manipulated perception through strategic aging. The James brothers played that game better than most. You observe, Jesse could be a fresh-faced boy or a hardened veteran, depending on which helped him disappear into a crowd. This chameleon-like ability to adjust apparent age was a crucial survival skill for career criminals, who needed to blend into new communities after their latest robbery or shooting. Historical records confirm this strategic age manipulation among frontier outlaws. Court documents from the same individual might list ages varying by as much as 20 years across different arrests. Without fingerprinting, photographs, or reliable birth records, a convincing performance of youth or experience could create an entirely new identity. A grey-bearded outlaw might shave clean, stand straighter, and present as a man 15 years younger, effectively becoming invisible to pursuers looking for an older man. The Dalton gang used brothers and cousins of different ages to confuse witnesses. The stranger adds, "Never knew which Dalton you were seeing, the 20-year-old, the 30-year-old, or someone in between." This deliberate age confusion extended beyond individual identity to create collective criminal identities where members could substitute for each other across apparent age boundaries. What historians find particularly fascinating about outlaw age manipulation is how it exploited societal assumptions about age-appropriate behavior. A criminal might claim to be just 17 when caught for a minor offense, playing on judicial reluctance to harshly punish youth. The same individual, when organizing a gang or establishing authority, might present as significantly older, leveraging the respect generally accorded to mature men. Cleverest trick I ever heard was Bellstar convincing a judge she was too old for prison. You recall? Woman couldn't have been more than 40 but came to court, stooped over with white hair and trembling hands. Next month, she was back to riding and shooting like a woman half that age. This theatrical manipulation of apparent age was particularly effective for female outlaws, who faced different sets of age-based expectations than their male counterparts. The stranger chuckles at this. Women have always been better at that game. My wife's aunt can look 20 years younger or older, depending on whether she's trying to attract attention or avoid it. This gender difference in age performance reflected broader social realities. Women were more practiced at managing appearance and navigating age-based expectations in everyday life, skills that translated effectively to criminal evasion. One particularly curious aspect of outlaw aging was the phenomenon of the ageless bandit criminals, whose reported ages in newspapers remained unchanged for decades. Historical researchers note cases where notorious outlaws were consistently described as about 30, in wanted posters spanning 15 or 20 years. This created the impression of criminality as a suspended state outside normal temporal progression. Outlaws didn't age like ordinary citizens. The papers had Billy the Kid killing his first man at 12 and his last at 21. The stranger notes, either he started mighty young or ended considerably older than reported. This compression of criminal careers into impossibly short time frames created more dramatic narratives but further complicated attempts to establish actual chronologies for these infamous figures. Most fascinating to historians is how these ageless outlaws manipulated not just their apparent physical age, but their generational identity. A 40-year-old criminal might position himself as a Civil War veteran when seeking respect in one territory, then as too young to have fought in the same war when establishing alibi in another. These shifting generational claims created multiple historical identities that were nearly impossible to reconcile without centralized records. Knew a man who rode with 3 different outlaw gangs under 3 different ages. You tell the stranger. Told the younger gang he was 40 and had military experience. Told the Wallace boys he was 28 and new to the game. Told the Carsons he was barely 20 and needed mentoring. This ability to age up or down according to circumstance allowed career criminals to reinvent themselves repeatedly across criminal organizations. The absence of standardized identification created perfect conditions for this age manipulation. A convincing story about being born during the big earthquake, or just after the Mexican War ended, was all the identity verification most communities required. With strategic adjustments to these origin stories, an outlaw could effectively reset his timeline with each new territory he entered. Most successful outlaws I've encountered, the stranger observes, were mighty vague about when they were born but had detailed stories about where. This pattern appears consistently in historical accounts. Successful criminal identities anchored themselves in specific geographic origins while remaining deliberately ambiguous about chronological ones. The specificity of place created credibility, while the ambiguity of time created flexibility. What's particularly interesting about frontier outlaws is how they exploited the same age ambiguity that ordinary citizens experienced, but with deliberate criminal intent. While most frontier dwellers adapted to chronological uncertainty out of necessity, outlaws weaponized this uncertainty, turning the frontier's casual relationship with precise ages into a strategic advantage for evading justice. Bellstar claimed to be born in 5 different years that I know of, you mention, and that's just what made it into print. This multiplicity of birth narratives created a kind of chronological smokescreen around infamous figures. Law enforcement, lacking centralized records, struggled to connect crimes committed by what appeared to be different individuals of different ages but were actually the same person at different points in their criminal career. The most sophisticated outlaws maintained multiple parallel identities across different age brackets simultaneously. Historical records describe criminals who established residences and relationships in separate communities under different names and apparent ages. A man might be a respected, middle-aged businessman in one town and a young hothead 20 miles away, effectively creating alibi through perceived age difference. Cleverest outlaws made their apparent age match their crime, the stranger notes. Young and reckless for bold robberies, mature and calculating for sophisticated schemes. This strategic alignment of apparent age with criminal methodology further complicated law enforcement efforts. Witnesses looking for a young gunslinger would overlook the middle-aged man calmly boarding a train with the stolen money. Historians still debate whether this fluid approach to criminal identity made frontier justice more or less effective. Some argue that the absence of reliable identification made prosecution nearly impossible for all but the most infamous outlaws. Others point out that frontier communities developed alternative verification methods, focusing on distinctive physical characteristics, speech patterns, or behavioral tells that couldn't be altered as easily as apparent age. Always found it interesting, you observe, how newspaper accounts aged outlaws differently depending on whether they were being portrayed as villains or folk heroes. This manipulation of perceived age in media narratives created additional layers of ambiguity. A young outlaw might be aged up to appear more threatening and calculating in one account, then aged down to seem more impressive for his accomplishments in another. The conversation around your campfire naturally lulls as you both contemplate these shadowy figures who existed outside conventional timelines. The outlaw's relationship with age represents the frontier experience taken to its extreme, not merely adapting to chronological uncertainty, but exploiting it, not simply living without birthdays but creating multiple birth dates as needed, not just accepting age ambiguity but weaponizing it. As the fire burns lower, casting longer shadows, there's a tacit acknowledgement that your companion could be anyone his age, like his past is whatever he claims it to be in this moment. In a world without verification, identity itself becomes as mutable as the shadows dancing on the prairie grass around you. and the line between adaptation and deception grows as thin as the smoke rising from your dying fire. The smoke from your dying campfire rises toward stars that have guided other travelers for countless generations. The indigenous peoples who inhabited these lands long before white settlers arrived had their own distinct understanding of time and aging, one that contrasted sharply with even the fluid frontier approach. As your conversation with the stranger continues, your thoughts turn to these alternative perspectives that existed alongside settler conceptions. Traded with a Lakota band last summer, the stranger mentions, rekindling the fire with practiced efficiency. Their elder couldn't have been younger than 80 by my reckoning, but they didn't measure his life in years at all. They counted 13 eagle feathers in his hair, each representing a winter when he'd led the band through starvation times. This achievement-based measurement of life progression was common across many Native American tribes, creating chronologies based on accomplishment rather than accumulated time. You nod, having had your own interactions with indigenous communities. Creek medicine woman I met couldn't tell me her age in years, but knew exactly how many generations of healing knowledge she carried. 7 cycles of teaching, she called it. This generational counting, measuring life not in personal years but in accumulated wisdom passed through successive teachers, created a different relationship with aging than either settler or modern approaches. Historical records confirm these distinctive indigenous perspectives on aging. Anthropological accounts describe tribal elders whose status derived not from reaching a specific age but from demonstrating wisdom, spiritual connection, or specialized knowledge. A relatively young person who showed exceptional insight or skill might be accorded elder status regardless of years lived, while merely growing old without developing wisdom carried no special standing. Noticed how differently they treat their old folks, you observe. In white settlements, an old man who can't work often gets pushed aside. In many tribes I've encountered, an elder's value increases as their physical capacity diminishes. They become full-time knowledge keepers. This inversion of aging value, prizing the very elders whose reduced physical capacity might make them burdens in settler communities, reflected fundamentally different cultural values around the purpose of later life stages. The stranger pokes thoughtfully at the fire. Comanche I knew divided life into distinct seasons rather than counting years. You weren't 50 or 60, you were in your wintertime with white hair, or your summertime with full strength. Seemed more natural somehow. This seasonal approach to life stages appears consistently across indigenous cultures, creating flexible age categories that acknowledged general life progression without imposing arbitrary numerical boundaries. What's particularly fascinating to historians is how these indigenous perspectives sometimes influenced settler communities at cultural boundaries. Frontier settlements with significant interaction with Native American communities occasionally adopted hybrid approaches to aging, maintaining European calendar years for some purposes while embracing more fluid, achievement-based status markers for others. Cherokee man I worked with had 2 birthdays, you recall. The white man's date they assigned him at the mission school, and his real birthday, when the corn was this high, which moved around the calendar depending on that year's growing season. This dual timekeeping, maintaining both rigid calendar dates and natural seasonal markers, created a bridge between worldviews for many indigenous people navigating both traditional and settler societies. One of the least known aspects of indigenous aging perspectives was their sophisticated recognition of developmental stages beyond the physical. Many tribes identified distinct spiritual and cognitive phases of later life that had no equivalent in European thinking. These stages weren't tied to chronological age, but to demonstrated characteristics: wisdom emergence, dream clarity, storytelling capacity, creating elder categories that transcended simple calculations of years lived. Kiowa elder explained to me once that true age isn't measured in winters survived, but in how many times you've remade yourself. The stranger says, by his count, some young warriors were older than grey-haired men who'd lived the same life for decades. This concept of personal reinvention as the true marker of life progression created a radically different approach to aging, one that valued transformative experience over mere survival. Historical accounts suggest this emphasis on transformation rather than accumulation may have created healthier psychological approaches to aging. Anthropological studies note lower rates of age-related depression and anxiety in traditional, indigenous communities where elders were valued for their current contributions rather than measured against their past capabilities or an arbitrary age standard. The most striking contrast between indigenous and settler aging concepts appeared in attitudes toward death. Pawnee medicine man told me white men fear death because we measure life in years, always counting what we might lose. You remember, said his people measured life in breaths well taken and stories well told, things that can't be counted or lost. This qualitative, rather than quantitative approach to life measurement created a different relationship with mortality itself. What anthropologists find particularly significant about indigenous aging concepts is how they integrated human lifespans into broader natural cycles. Many tribes conceptualized individual aging as simply one manifestation of the same cycles visible in seasons, animal migrations, and celestial movements. This integration created a cosmic context for personal aging that made it seem less arbitrary and more meaningful than European numerical approaches. Noticed how they mark life transitions differently too. The stranger observes, no arbitrary birthdays, but elaborate ceremonies for when a young person demonstrates readiness for new responsibilities. These transition rites, vision quests, hunting achievements, childbearing ceremonies created developmental markers based on demonstrated capacity rather than reaching a predetermined age, allowing each individual to progress at their natural pace. Historians still debate how these indigenous perspectives influenced frontier settlements over time. Some argue that prolonged contact with Native American communities gradually shifted settler thinking toward more flexible, functional approaches to aging. Others suggest that rigid European age concepts ultimately dominated as formal governance structures expanded across the West, imposing standardized legal ages for voting, property ownership, and other civil functions. Strangest thing I learned from the Hidatsa, you tell the stranger, was how some people could belong to different age cohorts, depending on context. A man might be counted among the young warriors for hunting, but among the elders for certain ceremonies. This contextual aging, being young in some respects and old in others, simultaneously created nuanced social categories that acknowledged the complex reality of human development better than simple numerical age. The fire flares briefly as a log collapses, illuminating your companion's weathered face. In the dancing light, you can see how his features reflect both his years of exposure to sun and wind, and the wisdom accumulated through those experiences. His age, by indigenous reckoning, would be measured not in the lines on his face, but in the depth of understanding visible in his eyes. Spent a winter with a Crow family once, the stranger says after a long silence. They had no word for old that carried the meaning it does for white folks. No sense of being past your prime. Their word for elders translated closer to those who see furthest. This linguistic difference reveals fundamental conceptual distinctions in how aging was understood, not as decline, but as expanded perspective. The most profound aspect of indigenous aging perspectives was perhaps their circular, rather than linear concept of time itself. Many tribes conceptualized time as cyclical, rather than progressive, with life stages representing positions on a continuous wheel rather than points on a forward-moving line. In this view, elders weren't reaching the end of anything but rather completing one cycle, while connecting to both ancestors and future generations. As your conversation quiets again, you both watch the sparks from the fire rise toward the immense starfield above. There's a shared recognition that perhaps these indigenous perspectives offered wisdom that settler society, with its obsession with measuring and counting years, had lost along the way. In a wilderness where precise chronology provided little practical value, These alternative approaches to understanding life's progression offered frameworks that better matched the rhythms of the natural world. The natural world's rhythms affected everyone on the frontier, but women experienced aging in ways distinctly different from their male counterparts. As your campfire conversation continues through the night, the stranger mentions his wife again, and your thoughts turn to the unique challenges frontier women faced as their bodies and social roles shifted without clear time. My Sarah's hands tell her age better than any calendar, the stranger says, looking down at his own weathered palms. 30 years of making soap has taken their softness, though she couldn't tell you if she's 45 or 53. This observation touches on how women's bodies on the frontier bore different markers of time's passage. Hands roughened by lye and hot water, backs bent from endless bending over washtubs and cooking fires, faces lined from squinting at fine stitching in poor light. You nod, thinking of the women you've known in your travels. Women seem to track their ages differently out here. They measure life by the children they've borne, not by years past. This reproductive timeline, counting life phases by births rather than birthdays, created a distinctly female chronology that often had little relationship to calendar years. A woman might not know if she was 38 or 42, but could tell you with precision that her third child came 2 years after the second and the fourth was born during the summer of the grasshopper plague. Historical records confirm this distinct female approach to life chronology. Women's diaries from the frontier rarely mention birthdays or ages, but meticulously track pregnancies, births, weaning times, and children's developmental milestones. These reproductive events created more meaningful life markers than arbitrary calendar dates, particularly in a world where survival depended on successful children more than knowing what year it was. My mother couldn't tell you when she was born, but knew exactly how many quilts she'd completed in her lifetime. 97. When I left home, you recall. This production-based timeline, measuring life through accumulated work rather than accumulated years, appears consistently in women's personal records. Frontier women tracked their lives through tangible outputs: quilts sewn, gardens planted, preserves put up, clothes made and remade as children grew. The most striking aspect of female aging on the frontier was how dramatically childbearing accelerated the process. Sarah was a girl when we married, the stranger says quietly. After our 5th child came, folks mistook her for my older sister rather than my wife. This rapid physical aging through repeated pregnancies in harsh conditions created a visual timeline etched directly on women's bodies: collapsed pelvic structures, permanently altered postures, prematurely grey hair. What medical historians find particularly significant about frontier female aging is how it differed from more civilized regions during the same period. Women in eastern cities might bear as many children, but did so with better nutrition, more recovery time between births, and some medical assistance. Frontier women often experienced pregnancies annually, worked physically demanding jobs throughout, and had only the most basic midwifery available. The physical toll accelerated visible aging dramatically. Strangest thing about women's aging out here, you observe, is how it happens in spurts, rather than gradually. A woman can look 24 years, then have a difficult birth, and suddenly appear 40, all in the space of months. This pattern of abrupt aging following reproductive trauma appears consistently in historical accounts, rather than the gradual aging process most men experienced. Women often aged in dramatic leaps following specific physical events. The stranger nods in recognition. Sarah's sister died in childbirth at 20-something. The neighbor woman who helped birth my children survived 12 deliveries, but looked ancient by 30. This stark reality of female mortality and accelerated aging shaped frontier gender dynamics in profound ways. A woman's relationship with time was fundamentally mediated by her reproductive experiences in ways men could observe but never truly comprehend. One particularly curious aspect of frontier female aging was how social status sometimes inverted standard age hierarchies. A young woman with multiple healthy children might command more respect than an older woman who had borne fewer offspring or lost many to disease. This reproduction-based status system created social hierarchies that often had little correlation with chronological age, prioritizing fertility and successful children over years lived. The midwife in our settlement can't be more than 35, but every woman defers to her like she's the oldest soul around, the stranger observes. This expertise-based authority was common in frontier female communities, where demonstrated skill in crucial areas, midwifery, herbal medicine, food preservation, could convey elder status, regardless of actual age. A gifted young healer might be treated with the deference normally reserved for grandmothers. Historical records reveal how differently women conceptualized their own aging compared to men's perceptions of female aging. While men often described frontier women as prematurely aged or worn beyond their years, women's own accounts focus more on increased capability, accumulated knowledge, and enhanced status within female community hierarchies. What men perceived as decline, women often experienced as transformation into more powerful social roles. My grandmother couldn't tell you how old she was, you recall, but knew exactly when she'd earned the right to speak first at women's gatherings. After delivering her 10th living child and training to younger women in midwifery, this achievement-based status progression created alternative aging milestones that had little to do with chronological age and everything to do with demonstrated mastery of essential female knowledge. What anthropologists find particularly fascinating about frontier female aging is how it created distinct life phases unrelated to numerical age categories. Women moved through stages defined by reproductive status: maiden, new wife, young mother, experienced mother, midwife, elder, with transitions marked by demonstrated capacity rather than reaching specific ages. A young mother might be chronologically older than an experienced mother depending on when each began bearing children. Women seem to age differently in their minds too, the stranger observes. My wife says she feels like 3 different people sometimes. The girl who married me, the mother who raised our children, and the woman she is now, like different lives lived one after another. This segmented self-perception appears frequently in women's frontier writing, describing life as a series of distinct identities rather than a continuous progression through time. The most peculiar aspect of frontier female aging was perhaps how it affected courtship and marriage. Without clear ages, compatibility was judged by developmental stage rather than years. A ready-for-marriage woman might be anywhere from 15 to 30 in modern reckoning, while a suitable husband might range from 18 to 50. These stage-based, rather than age-based matchings, created marriages with widely varying chronological age differences that communities nevertheless considered appropriate. Know a woman who's been widowed 3 times? You tell the stranger. Each husband was older than the last, by her reckoning. Though I suspect she might actually be older than her current husband if anyone knew their true ages. This fluid approach to marriage age created social possibilities that would have been scandalous in more chronologically rigid societies. Without birth certificates to prove age disparities, couples were judged by their apparent compatibility rather than years between them. Historians still debate whether this fluid approach to female aging was primarily liberating or constraining. Some argue that freedom from rigid age expectations allowed frontier women more flexible life paths, while others point out that accelerated aging through reproductive trauma shortened women's effective lifespans. Regardless of how those lifespans were measured, what's clear is that women experienced aging as a fundamentally different process than men, shaped by biological realities that created their own timeline independent of calendar years. As the night grows colder, both you and the stranger fall silent, contemplating the women in your lives and how differently they experience the passage of time. There's an unspoken acknowledgement that while men's aging on the frontier might be ambiguous in terms of years, women's aging followed its own inexorable pattern, marked not by birthdays never celebrated, but by children born, by bodies transformed through repeated creation and nurturing of new life, by wisdom accumulated through experiences no man could fully comprehend. Those incomprehensible experiences eventually ended for every frontier dweller, though when and how remained as uncertain as when they began. Death, like birth, existed in a chronological haze on the frontier, but the cemetery brought a strange new precision to life's end, if not its beginning. As your fire burns low, the conversation naturally turns to mortality, the final accounting that awaited everyone, regardless of how they'd measured their days. Strange thing about frontier graveyards, you observe, poking at the embers, they're the only place you'll find people assigned exact ages, even when nobody knew for certain. This peculiar practice, the retroactive assignment of precise ages at death, created the illusion of chronological certainty that had never existed in life. Headstones declaring John Smith, aged 67 years, 3 months, 4 days, represented undertakers' best guesses rather than documented fact. The stranger nods thoughtfully. Undertaker in our settlement adds 5 years to men and subtracts 5 from women as a matter of courtesy. This common practice, adjusting recorded death ages according to gender expectations, reflected cultural values rather than biographical accuracy. Men gained posthumous years to enhance their perceived wisdom and experience, while women lost years to preserve notions of feminine youth and beauty even in death. Historical records confirm this widespread fabrication of precise ages at death. Cemetery research reveals mathematical impossibilities throughout frontier graveyards. Siblings recorded as dying at 70 and 82 in the same year despite being twins, or a mother documented as younger than her daughter at time of death. These stone-carved inaccuracies created permanent, historical fictions that later researchers would have to carefully unravel. First time I saw a death certificate, you recall, the doctor spent more time arguing about the deceased's age than recording the cause of death. Widow said 60. Brother insisted 75. Doctor split the difference and wrote 68. This negotiated approach to posthumous age assignment appears consistently in early death records. Without birth documentation, a person's final age became a community consensus rather than a biographical fact. What historians find particularly fascinating about frontier death records is how they gradually imposed chronological order on communities that had lived without it. As territories became states and record-keeping standardized, death registrations required precise birth information that had never been documented. Families were forced to create origin stories with specific dates, where only vague seasonal memories had existed before. My father's headstone says he was born February 12, 1831, the stranger mentions. Truth is, nobody knew what month he was born, let alone the day. When he died, the stonecutter needed a date, so my mother chose Lincoln's birthday, figuring it was easier to remember. This practice of selecting historically significant dates for undocumented births appears frequently in frontier grave markers, creating clusters of recorded birthdays around Christmas, Independence Day, and other memorable dates. The most peculiar aspect of frontier death recording was how it retroactively created birthdays that had never been celebrated in life. A man who had lived 50-some years without knowing his birth date might be posthumously assigned a precise birthday, born March 17, 1822, that would become his official birth date in historical records. This posthumous precision created paper identities more chronologically defined than the lived identities they purported to document. Widow Johnson had 3 different ages on her headstone. You remember? Stonemason chiseled 62 years first. Then her son arrived and had him change it to 58 years. Then her sister came and insisted on 65 years. You can still see the corrections if you look close. This physical evidence of age negotiation, visible corrections on stone monuments, provides tangible proof of how fluid age remained even in death. One little-known fact about frontier burial practices was how they created the first systematic age records for many communities. Undertakers and cemetery managers, requiring some form of chronological organization for their records, became the pioneering demographers of frontier society. Their burial logs, noting estimated ages at death and approximate birth years, often constituted the first attempts at comprehensive age documentation for entire settlements. Cemetery record-keeping made our schoolteacher realize half the children had the same birthday, the stranger says with a slight smile. May 1st for everyone who didn't know their real date. Made for crowded celebration days, this administrative standardization, assigning default dates to the undocumented, created artificial patterns that would perplex later demographic researchers studying frontier population trends. Historical analysis reveals how death records gradually standardized frontier age perception. As burial documentation accumulated over decades, communities developed reference points for approximating ages, about as old as Widow Miller, who died at 72 or younger than the Peterson boy who was 19 when he drowned. These community benchmarks created functional age approximations despite the absence of birth records. Strangest gravestone I ever saw, you tell the stranger, simply said Elizabeth Wells, lived sufficiently. No dates, no ages, just that assessment. This resistance to posthumous age assignment appears occasionally in frontier cemeteries. Markers that deliberately omit numerical ages in favor of qualitative descriptions. These rare monuments perhaps most honestly reflected the frontier's relationship with chronological age, acknowledging its ultimate irrelevance compared to the quality of life lived. The formalization of death recording created unique challenges for indigenous populations. Saw a reservation cemetery once, the stranger recalls. Government agent had assigned birth dates to everyone, January 1st of whatever year made them the right age for whatever policy was being implemented. This administrative age assignment, creating official birth dates for bureaucratic convenience, imposed artificial chronologies on cultures that had measured life stages in entirely different ways. What mortuary researchers find most significant about frontier death records is how they created permanent identities that the deceased themselves might not have recognized. A man who had lived his entire life knowing only that he was born the winter after the Big Flood might be immortalized with the precise birth date of November 23, 1843, a specificity he had never claimed in life and might have found amusingly arbitrary. My grandmother's marker says she lived to 92, you mention. Family legend says she was over 100, but the census taker thought that seemed excessive and recorded her as 85 instead. This official reduction of exceptional longevity appears frequently in frontier death records. Without documentation to prove advanced ages, officials often assigned more reasonable ages to the very elderly, effectively erasing unusually long lives from historical record. Historians still debate whether this posthumous age standardization was primarily beneficial or harmful to historical understanding. Some argue that even approximate death ages provided crucial demographic data otherwise completely absent, while others point out that fabricated precision created illusory certainty about frontier life patterns, the stone-carved ages that appear definitive to modern researchers often represent little more than educated guesses or family preferences. The most profound aspect of frontier death recording was perhaps how it fundamentally changed the relationship between age and identity. In life, frontier dwellers existed in chronological ambiguity, defining themselves through capabilities, experiences, and relationships rather than accumulated years. In death, they were permanently assigned numerical identities. John Smith, aged 67, that reduced complex lives to simple calculations many would have found foreign to their lived experience. As your campfire burns down to glowing coals, you and the stranger contemplate this final irony of frontier life, that communities which had functioned perfectly well without knowing anyone's exact age, suddenly required precise numbers when recording deaths. The cemetery brought a mathematical certainty to life's end that had never existed during life itself, imposing chronological order posthumously on existences that had unfolded according to natural rhythms rather than numbered years. Natural rhythms guided life on the frontier, but human ingenuity still sought ways to manipulate time's effects, especially when it came to aging. As the night deepens around your diminishing fire, the conversation turns to one of the frontier's most colorful phenomena, the flourishing market of anti-aging tonics that promised to restore youth to those who feared growing old. Whenever that mysterious process had begun, ever try any of those miracle elixirs? You ask the stranger. noticing how he rubs his stiffening knee in the night's growing chill. The patent medicine trade thrived in territories where doctors were scarce and aging bodies abundant, creating a perfect market for bottled promises of renewed youth. The stranger chuckles, a sound somewhere between amusement and embarrassment. Bought a bottle of Kickapoo Indian Sagwa after my back gave out during spring planting. Tasted like whiskey mixed with molasses and gunpowder. Can't say if it made me younger, but after drinking enough, I certainly cared less about how old I felt. His experience was typical of frontier encounters with these dubious concoctions, effects owing more to alcohol content than any rejuvenating properties. Historical analysis of these patent medicines reveals astonishing alcohol percentages, often between 20% and 40%, creating immediate sensations of warmth and well-being that consumers might interpret as rejuvenation. The most popular youth restorers contained not just alcohol but cocaine, opium derivatives, or other powerful stimulants that temporarily masked pain and fatigue, creating the illusion of restored vitality. The medicine show that came through our settlement last year had an age-reversing demonstration. You recall, old man drank the tonic on stage, slipped behind a curtain, and a younger man emerged claiming transformation. Half the town bought bottles despite the obvious trickery. These theatrical demonstrations, using relatives with similar features or simply different actors, played perfectly to audiences eager to believe in age manipulation in a world where age itself remained ambiguous. What consumer historians find particularly fascinating about frontier anti-aging products is how they marketed to a population that often didn't know their actual ages. Unable to promise specific numerical reductions, look 10 years younger. These products, instead, focused on functional restoration, the ability to work longer, sleep better, maintain sexual vitality, or reduce pain. The promises addressed the practical concerns of a population that measured age through capability rather than years. My neighbor swears by Dr. Williams' pink pills for pale people, the stranger offers. Claims they've kept her looking younger than her sister. Course, nobody knows how old either of them actually is. So hard to verify the claim. This impossible to disprove marketing created perfect conditions for placebo effects. Without objective age measurements, any subjective improvement might be attributed to the product. The most curious aspect of frontier anti-aging remedies was their frequent appropriation of indigenous wisdom, real or imagined. Products like Cherokee Liver Tonic or Shawnee Youth Extract claimed to harness ancient Native American secrets of longevity, exploiting settler fascination with indigenous knowledge, while completely fabricating their supposed traditional ingredients. Trading Post sells genuine Navajo age-defying bomb, you mention with a skeptical smile. Made in Chicago according to the fine print on the label. This cultural appropriation for marketing purposes created the illusion of accessing timeless wisdom about aging from cultures perceived as existing outside conventional European time constraints. Historical analysis of patent medicine advertisements reveals how they exploited frontier age ambiguity. Unable to make specific claims about numerical age reduction, advertisements instead featured before and after testimonials describing functional improvements. I could not harness my own horse last winter, but after 3 bottles of reinvigoration tonic, I now plow from sunup to sundown. These capability-based testimonials resonated with frontier values around aging as functional decline rather than numerical progression. What pharmaceutical historians find particularly notable about frontier anti-aging products is how they created their own pseudoscientific aging theories to explain their supposed effectiveness. Dr. Morgan's cellular rejuvenator claimed to restore youthful balance to aging cellular structures, while Vitality Magnetic Tonic promised to remagnetize the life force diminished by advancing years. These meaningless explanations provided satisfying justifications for products that did nothing beyond their alcohol and stimulant effects. Funniest thing I ever saw, the stranger says, was a youth tonic guaranteeing users would never know their true age, which was already true for most of us out here anyway. This unintentionally honest marketing highlighted the peculiar relationship between age ambiguity and anti-aging promises. In a society where precise age was already unknown, fears of aging focused on functional decline rather than numerical milestones. The gender differences in anti-aging marketing were particularly striking on the frontier. Products aimed at men emphasized restored work capacity and sexual vitality, while women's tonics promised preserved beauty and fertility. Johnson's female youth preserver claimed to maintain womanly appearance despite the ravages of frontier life, playing on the accelerated physical aging many women experienced through repeated pregnancies and harsh living conditions. Widow Carson spent her butter money on Bloom of Youth face cream, you remember? Said it took 10 years off her appearance, though whether she looked 40 or 50 to begin with was anybody's guess. This subjective before and after assessment, impossible to verify without objective age records, created perfect conditions for perceived effectiveness, regardless of actual results. The most outlandish aspect of frontier anti-aging marketing was how it offered impossibly precise age calculations in a society without birth records. Persian age calculator kits claimed to determine a person's true age through measurements of facial features, allowing users to then track their age reduction through subsequent tonic use. These pseudoscientific measuring devices created the illusion of objective age assessment where none was possible. Traveling phrenologist told my wife her skull showed she was 52 years old. The stranger says, with a snort, offered to sell her rejuvenating skull massage treatments to reverse the condition. She showed him the business end of our shotgun instead. This intersection of fraudulent age, determination, and anti-aging solutions created a perfect closed system, first convincing people they were older than they thought, then selling them remedies for this newly discovered problem. What social historians find most significant about frontier anti-aging products is how they gradually introduced age consciousness to populations previously unconcerned with exact chronology. By marketing fears about being too old, these products began shifting frontier thinking toward more age-focused identity despite the continued absence of reliable birth records. Communities that had functioned perfectly well without age awareness began developing new anxieties about aging processes they previously accepted as natural life progression. Never thought much about getting old until that silver-tongued salesman came through explaining all the terrible things happening inside my body, you admit. Suddenly found myself worrying about conditions I'd never heard of before. This manufactured age anxiety, creating concern about chronological aging in a population that had previously measured life in functional terms, represented an early form of the age-based marketing that would dominate the coming century. The stranger nods in recognition. My Sarah never fretted about her age until she read a magazine advertisement claiming women over 40 needed special tonics. Suddenly, she was trying to calculate if that included her. This imposition of arbitrary age thresholds for health interventions gradually shifted frontier thinking toward numerical age categories despite the continued absence of documentation. As your fire burns down to the final embers, you both contemplate this curious frontier contradiction, a population with no reliable way to determine their own ages becoming increasingly concerned about those very ages through clever marketing. The snake oil salesman had achieved something remarkable, selling age consciousness itself to people who had previously lived without it, creating a problem that hadn't existed before, offering expensive solutions. The clever marketing that made frontier folk suddenly conscious of their uncertain ages would soon give way to something far more powerful, the railroad's unforgiving timetable, which would transform the West's relationship with time itself. As you and the stranger sit in companionable silence, the distant whistle of a locomotive carries across the prairie, a reminder that the timeless frontier is yielding to mechanical precision with each new mile of track. Hear that? The stranger asks, tilting his head toward the sound. That's the future coming on schedule, whether we're ready or not. The railroad didn't just connect distant places, it connected different relationships with time. Every rail line pushed the rigid chronology of industrial society deeper into territories that had functioned for decades without clocks, calendars, or precise birthdays. You nod, familiar with how the railroad was changing frontier life. Town 20 miles east just put up a clock tower by their station. Set their time by the railroad schedule. First time anyone there has lived by the minute rather than by the sun. This imposition of standardized time represents one of the most profound yet underappreciated changes brought by westward expansion, the replacement of natural timekeeping with mechanical precision. Historical records document this chronological colonization with remarkable clarity. Towns without railroad connections continued measuring days by sunrise and sunset, marking seasons by natural events, and recording ages through functional milestones. Meanwhile, railroad towns, synchronized to standard time, scheduled activities by the clock rather than daylight, and began maintaining more precise records of births, deaths, and ages. Station master in our settlement is the only man with an accurate timepiece, the stranger observes. Now he's got everybody adjusting their days to match his watch instead of the sun. This centralization of timekeeping authority, placing chronological power in the hands of railroad officials, fundamentally altered social hierarchies that had previously organized around natural rhythms and functional age wisdom. What historians find particularly fascinating about the railroad's temporal impact is how quickly it transformed age documentation practices. Towns connected to rail lines typically established formal birth registries within 5 years of connection, creating the first systematic records of chronological age for populations that had previously existed. Without such documentation, children born in these newly connected communities received something their parents never had, an official, recorded birth date. My youngest is the only one of my children with a birth certificate, you mention. Doctor filled it out the day she was born, sent it to the county office on the next train. Now she always knows exactly how old she is, unlike the rest of us. This generational divide between those born before and after the arrival of standardized documentation created families with mixed age awareness, where younger members had precise chronologies, while older generations remained in age ambiguity. The most profound impact of railroad timekeeping was perhaps how it standardized life cycle events that had previously followed natural or functional timelines. Schooling, employment, and retirement increasingly adhered to chronological requirements rather than demonstrated capability. A child entered school at age 6, regardless of readiness, worked until 65, regardless of ability, and received age-based benefits, regardless of need, all requiring precise birth documentation that hadn't existed in pre-railroad communities. The mining company that opened near us won't hire anyone over 50, the stranger says, with a frown. Men who've been working their own claims for decades get turned away because they can't prove they're young enough, even when they can outwork men half their age. This emergence of chronological discrimination, judging capability by documented age, rather than demonstrated skill, represented a fundamental shift from frontier functional assessment to industrial age categorization. What social historians find particularly noteworthy about this transition is how unevenly it affected different populations. Urban centers and transportation hubs adopted precise age documentation rapidly, while remote areas maintained functional age assessments for decades longer. This created neighboring communities with entirely different relationships to aging, one measuring life in numbered years, the other still tracking life stages through capability and accomplishment. Funny thing about those birth certificates, you observe, they're creating two kinds of people, those who know their birthdays and those who don't. The younger folks celebrate every year, while the rest of us just keep working until we can't. This bifurcation of age awareness, precise chronology for younger generations, versus continued ambiguity for older ones, created social divides within frontier communities that hadn't existed before the railroad's arrival. The railroad's standardization extended beyond official documentation to create the first widespread celebration of birthdays in many frontier regions. Train schedules allowed for the reliable delivery of cards and gifts, While increased communication spread Eastern customs westward, communities that had never marked individual birthdays began adopting these celebrations, at least for the younger generation with documented birth dates. My granddaughter insists on baking me a birthday cake every July 15th, the stranger says, with a gentle smile. Dates completely made up. Just picked it because I like summer, but it makes her happy to celebrate, like they do back east. This adoption of arbitrary birth dates for older generations without documentation became increasingly common as birthday celebrations normalized. People who had lived decades without knowing their birth dates simply selected one that seemed reasonable or pleasant. Historical records reveal how these assigned birth dates often clustered around significant holidays or seasons, creating demographic anomalies that would perplex later researchers. Official documents show improbable spikes in recorded births on January 1st, July 4th, and December 25th, not reflecting actual birth patterns, but the tendency to select memorable dates when forced to choose a specific birth date for previously undocumented individuals. The census taker who came through last year insisted everyone provide an exact birth date. You recall? Half the settlement suddenly remembered they were born on Christmas or New Year's. This retroactive assignment of precise birth dates created the illusion of chronological certainty in official records, while actually preserving the age ambiguity of frontier life beneath a veneer of documentation. What demographic historians find most significant about the railroad era is how it gradually replaced event-based chronologies with numerical ones, where people once measured life by the winter after the Big Flood or 2 years before the Grasshopper Plague. They increasingly referenced specific years -1878, 1885, 1892, as railroad connections integrated local timelines into national chronologies through newspapers, mail service, and telegraphs. Newspaper comes on the Tuesday train now, the stranger observes. Everybody knows what day it is when the paper arrives. Before the railroad, half the settlement couldn't have told you if it was Wednesday or Thursday without checking the position of the sun. This anchoring of days to regular train schedules created the first widespread adherence to the 7-day week in many frontier regions, replacing looser patterns of work and rest based on weather, seasonal needs, or physical capacity. The most curious aspect of the railroad's chronological influence was how it created instant age consciousness in previously age-ambiguous communities. Towns connected to rail lines suddenly needed to know children's ages for school enrollment, men's ages for labor regulations, and elders' ages for pension eligibility. Families that had functioned perfectly well without age documentation found themselves scrambling to establish, approximate birth dates that satisfied new bureaucratic requirements. My father had to decide how old he was when the pension program started. You tell the stranger. Settled on 73 because it made him eligible immediately, though he might have been anywhere from 68 to 84, all anyone knew. This strategic age selection, choosing chronological identity based on benefit eligibility, became common as age-based programs expanded across previously undocumented populations. Historians still debate whether the railroad's imposition of standardized time and age documentation primarily benefited or harmed frontier communities. Some argue that chronological standardization created more equitable systems and better record-keeping, while others point to the loss of more flexible, functional assessments that had allowed for individual variations in development and aging. What's clear is that the railroad brought not just physical connection but chronological colonization, fundamentally altering how frontier populations understood their place in time. As the last embers of your campfire fade to ash, you and the stranger contemplate this transformation happening around you. The replacement of natural rhythms with mechanical timetables, of functional assessment with numerical categorization, of fluid life stages with rigid age boundaries. The railroad whistle sounds again in the distance, a reminder that the ageless frontier is giving way to an age-conscious future with each passing train. The whistle fades across the prairie, leaving only the vast silence of the night and the dying remnants of your fire. That same silence will eventually swallow all memories of the ageless generations, those who lived and died, without ever knowing exactly when they were born or how old they were when they passed. As dawn approaches, your conversation with the stranger turns to legacy. What remains when people who never knew their own ages are themselves forgotten? Sometimes wonder what they'll say about us, the stranger murmurs, wrapping his blanket tighter against the pre-dawn chill. All these lives lived without proper recording, will they even believe we existed? This existential question touches on a profound truth about frontier legacy. Without the documentation modern society takes for granted, how will future generations understand lives that left such faint paper trails? You poke at the embers, coaxing one last flare of warmth from the dying fire. They'll find our handiwork, the buildings, the fences, the irrigation ditches. They'll know somebody was here, even if they can't put names and dates to us. This physical legacy, the transformation of landscape through human effort, remains the most enduring testament to generations who lived without chronological precision. Long after paper records have disintegrated, the land itself bears witness to their existence. Historical preservation efforts confirm this material persistence. Archaeological studies of frontier settlements reveal intricate physical chronologies in the absence of written records, layers of construction showing how homesteads expanded, fence lines moved, and farming practices evolved. These physical timelines often provide more accurate histories than retroactively created paper records with their arbitrarily assigned dates and ages. My father built our barn without knowing his age, the stranger says, and that barn will outlast any paper saying when he was born. This prioritization of tangible creation over biographical documentation characterized the frontier mindset. What mattered wasn't recording your life, but building something that would serve future generations, whether or not they knew your name or age when you built it. What historians find particularly poignant about frontier legacy is how it exists largely outside conventional biographical frameworks. Modern historical understanding relies heavily on chronological precision, knowing exactly when people were born, what ages they were during significant events, and when exactly they died. Frontier lives resist this neat categorization, existing instead as contributions to community development without clear chronological boundaries. Town council wanted to put together a historical record last year, you recall. Asked everybody for their birth dates and family histories. Half the settlement couldn't provide dates, just stories. This tension between modern historical methods and frontier reality continues to challenge preservation efforts. Communities with rich oral traditions but sparse documentation struggle to translate their heritage into formats that satisfy contemporary historical standards. The most curious aspect of frontier legacy is perhaps how it created communities with shared memories but conflicting chronologies. Historical accounts from the same settlement often place identical events years apart, not through deliberate falsehood but through genuine chronological uncertainty. Without external validation, memory placed events in personal timelines that rarely aligned precisely with neighbors' recollections. 3 different families claimed their ancestor built the first house in our settlement. The stranger observes, with a slight smile, might all be telling the truth as they understand it, just can't agree on when these houses appeared. This chronological uncertainty complicates historical preservation, creating competing origin stories that can't be resolved through documentation that never existed. What cultural historians find most significant about frontier legacy is how it challenges fundamental assumptions about historical knowledge. Modern historical methods prioritize precise dating, demographic categorization, and statistical analysis, approaches that simply can't be applied to populations that existed without these forms of self-documentation. This methodological mismatch risks rendering frontier experiences invisible to conventional historical analysis. My grandmother knew remedies for every ailment imaginable, you tell the stranger. Never wrote down a single recipe or treatment. All that knowledge died with her because nobody thought to preserve what couldn't be dated and categorized. This loss of wisdom that existed outside formal documentation systems represents one of the greatest casualties of the transition from frontier flexibility to modern standardization. Historical records reveal how imperfectly this undocumented wisdom transferred into modern systems. When territorial governments began requiring formal medical licensing, traditional healers who couldn't provide proof of training or birth documentation found their generations of effective practice. Suddenly, knowledge that had served communities for decades disappeared because it couldn't satisfy new bureaucratic requirements for chronological precision. The old ways of measuring a life are disappearing, the stranger says quietly. Used to be a man was measured by what he built, who he helped, what wisdom he shared. Now it's all about how many years he lived and what papers he can produce. This shift from qualitative to quantitative life assessment fundamentally changed how communities understood individual worth, gradually replacing accomplishment-based evaluation with chronology-based categorization. What anthropologists find particularly fascinating about this transitional period is how communities attempted to bridge these different value systems. Frontier obituaries often combine precise death dates, newly important in bureaucratic society, with accomplishment-based assessments. Built 3 watermills, mother to 11 children, knew every medicinal plant in the territory, creating hybrid remembrances that honored both old and new ways of measuring a life's worth. They're putting up historical markers now, you observe, trying to assign exact dates to events nobody recorded precisely when they happened. This retroactive chronological ordering, imposing specific years on events that participants experienced without numerical dating, creates an artificial precision that fundamentally misrepresents how frontier life was actually experienced and remembered. The most poignant aspect of frontier legacy is perhaps how it challenges our understanding of individual identity itself. Modern conceptions of selfhood are deeply entwined with chronological age. We define ourselves substantially by how many years we've lived and where this places us in expected life stages. Frontier individuals constructed identity without this chronological scaffolding, defining themselves through relationships, capabilities, and community roles rather than accumulated years. My father never knew if he was 50 or 65, the stranger says, but he knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. Not sure the new way of counting every year improves on that self-knowledge. This observation touches on a profound philosophical question about whether precise age awareness enhances or diminishes authentic self-understanding, whether knowing exactly how old you are clarifies or constrains your sense of personal possibility. As the first pale light of dawn touches the eastern horizon, you both fall silent, contemplating these ageless generations whose legacy surrounds you in the settled frontier. Their handiwork remains visible in every direction, in fence lines and water systems, in established towns and cultivated fields. While their personal chronologies have faded into uncertainty, they transformed a continent without ever knowing exactly when they were born or how old they were when they accomplished their greatest works. The most enduring legacy of these chronologically ambiguous pioneers may be the unintentional wisdom their experience offers to age-obsessed modern society. They demonstrated that meaningful lives could be lived without birthday celebrations, that communities could function without age-based categories, that accomplishment need not correlate with accumulated years, and that identity could be constructed around capability and character rather than chronological milestones. As full dawn approaches and you prepare to break camp, there's a tacit acknowledgement between you and the stranger that you've shared something increasingly rare, a conversation untethered from precise chronology, where neither participant knew exactly how old they were or felt any need to establish this detail. Like the generations you've discussed through the night, you've connected through shared experience and observation rather than numerical identification. The ageless generations may have lacked birth certificates and precise chronologies, but they left behind something more substantial, a continent transformed by their labor, communities built through their cooperation, and wisdom passed through their stories. Their legacy exists not in precisely dated achievements, but in the cumulative impact of countless lives lived according to natural rhythms, rather than mechanical timekeeping, lives measured by seasons and accomplishments, rather than numbered years. As the first rays of sunlight stretch across the prairie grass, illuminating the landscape these ageless pioneers transformed, you find yourself breathing more slowly, your thoughts drifting toward sleep. The campfire has long since cooled to ash, but the stranger's stories linger in your mind, blending with your own memories of a frontier where time moved differently. The rigid schedules and precise birthdays of the modern world seem distant now, replaced by the gentler rhythms of a life measured by changing seasons and growing capabilities. Perhaps there was wisdom in not knowing exactly how old you were, in letting your body and spirit determine your place in life, rather than arbitrary numbers on a calendar. As sleep approaches, you wonder what these ageless generations would make of today's birthday obsessions, age-specific milestones, and retirement countdowns. Would they find our chronological precision liberating or constraining? Would they pity or envy our constant awareness of exactly how many years we've accumulated? Their legacy whispers through the rustling grass around you, a reminder that meaningful lives were lived without precise timekeeping, that communities thrived without age documentation, that people found their purpose without knowing their exact place on life's timeline. Perhaps in their chronological uncertainty lies a forgotten freedom, the liberty to be defined by who you are and what you can do, rather than how many years you've seen. This thought follows you into dreams, where time flows like a river without markers, and your age is whatever the moment requires it to be.